My daughter-in-law made herself very clear the morning after my son died. "Don't waste your breath expecting a single dollar of Keaton's estate," she said, her voice as flat as a lawyer reading a lease. "That money is mine." But when the attorney opened the folder at the reading of the will 6 weeks later, she went so pale I thought she might pass out right there in that leather chair. Before I tell you how we got there, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from. I was in the crawl space under the Hendersons' house when my phone buzzed. 67 years old, and I was still doing electrical work part-time, not because I needed the money, but because I didn't know what to do with my hands if I wasn't fixing something. The work kept me connected to the world. Tracing a circuit, tightening a wire, it gave the day a shape that retiring hadn't. I pulled myself out from under the floorboards and checked the screen. Unknown number, area code 214, Dallas. Is this Merle Caston? It is. Mr. Caston, my name is Dr. Ansley at Baylor University Medical Center. I'm very sorry to tell you this. Your son Keaton suffered a severe hemorrhagic stroke this morning at approximately 8:45. He was brought in by ambulance but passed away at 10:17. I'm so sorry for your loss. The phone felt heavy as a brick. I sat down on the porch steps without meaning to, the boards groaning under my weight. A stroke. Yes, sir. He was 44 years old. These things can happen without any warning at all. Keaton had just turned 44 the previous month. I'd called him on his birthday and we'd talked for 20 minutes, maybe a little longer. He'd sounded good, busy, the way he always was, but good. He mentioned a new mixed-use project he was developing in Fort Worth. Said he'd been working too many late nights. I told him to slow down. He laughed and said, "You sound just like Mom." His mother, Darlene, had died when Keaton was 16. Breast cancer. It took her fast, 8 months from diagnosis to the end. After that, it was just the two of us in our house in Terre Haute, eating cereal for dinner more nights than I'd like to admit, figuring out together how to keep going. I sat on those porch steps for a long time before I called my daughter-in-law. She and Keaton had married 3 years ago. She was 38 to his 41, a former interior designer who transitioned into what she called lifestyle consulting, which as far as I could tell meant attending charity events and redecorating their house in the Lakewood neighborhood of Dallas every 18 months. She was beautiful in the way of someone who worked very hard at being beautiful, and sharp in a way that never quite sharpened into warmth. I'd met her twice, once at the wedding, where she'd looked through me like a window she didn't plan to open, and once at Christmas the year after, where she'd spent most of the visit on her phone in the kitchen while Keaton and I watched football in the other room. She answered on the fourth ring. "I heard," she said, "no greeting, no preamble." "I'm so sorry, Portia, I know how." "I'm handling everything. You don't need to come down." I stood up from those steps slowly. "He's my son. I'm coming." A pause. "Suit yourself." The line went dead. I called back 3 more times over the next hour, voicemail each time. I tried again in the evening, same result. The third day I gave up waiting and threw my old canvas bag in the truck. It's about 12 hours from Terre Haute to Dallas if you push it. I left before sunrise and drove through the flat farmland of southern Illinois, through St. Louis before rush hour, and into Missouri with the sun climbing behind me. I had a thermos of coffee and a ham sandwich I'd made the night before. Somewhere past Springfield, the memories started coming. Keaton at 14, sitting at our kitchen table with a wire schematic I'd drawn for him on a paper bag. He was trying to learn how electricity worked because he wanted to rewire the lamp in his bedroom, and he'd sat there for 45 minutes until he understood how the circuit flowed. He had that quality, a stubborn, methodical patience. He didn't move on until things made sense to him. Keaton at 19, calling me from his dorm at Indiana State to say he'd gotten a C in economics and was thinking of switching majors. "Don't switch because of one grade," I told him. "Switch because you found something you'd rather do." He thought about it for a week and didn't switch. He graduated with a business degree and drove to Dallas with $2,000 in his account and a pickup truck not much newer than mine. I pulled over at a rest stop in Arkansas to eat and let the memories settle. An older man at the picnic table across the way nodded in that quiet way strangers do when they recognize grief on someone's face without needing to know the details. By the time I reached the outer edges of Dallas, the sky had turned the deep orange of a Texas evening. The freeway signs pointed toward neighborhoods I didn't know, exits advertising the kind of life my son had built for himself out here. A life I'd seen only in photographs and heard about in phone calls that always ended a little too soon because we'd both run out of neutral ground to stand on. My daughter-in-law met me at the door of their house in Lakewood. The house was the kind you saw in magazines. Craftsman exterior, immaculate landscaping, a double-wide driveway with her white Range Rover parked at an angle, suggesting she'd never once worried about leaving room for anyone else. Inside, the floors were a pale herringbone oak. Every surface held maybe 2 or 3 carefully chosen objects. The whole place had the temperature of a hotel lobby. She looked me over the way. Someone eyes a piece of furniture that doesn't belong in the room. "You can stay in the guest suite," she said, "through there." She pointed down a hallway without looking at me. "The funeral home needs a decision on Saturday." "What kind of decision?" "Burial or cremation. I've already told them cremation. It's what Keaton would have wanted." I had a photo of Keaton in my shirt pocket, him at 12, grinning with a gap where his front tooth used to be, holding a catfish he'd pulled out of Raccoon Creek. Darlene had taken the picture. I'd kept it in a frame on my workbench for 20 years. "Keaton told me once he wanted to be buried next to his mother," I said. Portia looked at me for the first time, a slow measuring look. "I think you're misremembering." "I don't think I am." "He mentioned cremation to me multiple times. He was very clear about it." She said it with the finality of someone who'd already won an argument they hadn't started yet. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have calls to make." The guest suite was perfect, perfectly made, perfectly silent, perfectly empty of anything suggesting a person had ever slept in it for comfort rather than convenience. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Keaton's photo for a long time before I set it on the nightstand. My old friend Barlow called that night around 10. I'd known Barlow since we were both young union electricians in the 70s. He'd moved to Cincinnati years ago when he remarried, but we still talked every week, the way you maintain friendships with people who knew you before life did its rearranging. "How is she treating you?" he asked. "Like a problem she hasn't figured out what to do with yet." "You need me to come?" "Not yet." "Merle, that boy loved you. Don't let anybody make you forget that while you're down there." I held the phone after he hung up and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a city that wasn't mine. The service was held on a Thursday afternoon at a funeral chapel in East Dallas, the kind of place with thick carpets and people in dark suits who moved softly and made grief feel organized. My daughter-in-law had filled the guest list with people from Keaton's professional world. Developers, investors, a couple of city councilmen, a woman who apparently wrote a real estate column for a Dallas magazine. I recognized none of them. I sat in the third row. She sat in the front, flanked by 2 women in matching black dresses, who existed mainly to hand her things at the right moment. Midway through the reception, I heard her voice carrying just far enough from where she stood near the flower arrangements. "His father drove all the way from Indiana." The tone was the same you'd use to describe someone showing up uninvited to a dinner party. "Oh," said her companion. Keaton always felt obligated. You know how it is. Some fathers just weren't really present, and then when the circumstances change, she smoothed the front of her dress. "But I've made sure everything is handled properly." I set down the cup I'd been holding and walked over. "Portia," I said, "not today." She turned. Something shifted across her face. Not embarrassment, but a quick recalculation. "Of course," she said, pivoting into a softer register. "Today is for Keaton." But at the door as I was leaving, she pulled me aside. "I've been very patient," she said, her voice low, "but you should understand something before you get any ideas. Don't expect a single dollar of Keaton's estate. The will is straightforward. I'm his wife. Everything goes to me." She held my gaze. "There's nothing here for you, Merle. Go back to Indiana." I didn't say anything. I walked back to my truck and sat in the parking lot for a while before I could drive. At the Hampton Inn off the freeway, $68 a night, I called Barlow and told him what she'd said. 67 years old, I said. Drove 12 hours to be told to go home. "You're not going home," Barlow said. It wasn't a question. "Not yet." The call from the law firm came 4 days later. I hadn't known Keaton had a personal attorney. He'd never mentioned it. But apparently he'd maintained a relationship with a firm called Hutchins and Price for the past 4 years, handling his real estate contracts and, as it turned out, his estate planning. The paralegal who called asked me to come in for the reading of the will on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. I asked if my daughter-in-law would also be there. She said Mrs. Caston had been notified. The offices were in a building in uptown Dallas with a lobby that took itself seriously. I wore the dark suit I'd bought for Darlene's funeral and had worn to every important occasion since. It didn't fit quite the way it used to. I'd lost some weight in the shoulders over the years, but it was what I had, and it was clean. My daughter-in-law was already there when I arrived. She had her attorney with her, a man named Galvin I'd heard about from the paralegal. Apparently she'd hired him within 48 hours of Keaton's death. He had the confident, well-fed look of a man who billed $400 an hour and had long since made peace with that fact. She didn't acknowledge me when I sat down. Thomas Hutchins, the senior partner, was a man in his late 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a careful, unhurried manner. He thanked everyone for coming, said the words attorneys say in rooms like this one, then opened the folder on the table in front of him. The last will and testament of Keaton Lawrence Caston, executed November 14, 2024. He read through the formal language, the declarations of sound mind and absence of duress. My daughter-in-law sat with the posture of someone attending a ceremony where the outcome was not in question. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her and a pen she wasn't using, just resting there in her hand like a prop. Then Hutchins turned to the bequests. To the Keaton Caston Memorial Scholarship Fund, established at Ivy Tech Community College in Terre Haute, Indiana, I leave the sum of $500,000 to support first-generation students pursuing degrees in business or construction management. I hadn't known about any scholarship fund. I sat very still. To my father, Merle Thomas Caston, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including all business interests, investment accounts, real property holdings, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $17.4 million. The room was quiet for about 3 full seconds. Then my daughter-in-law said, "What?" It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a floor giving way beneath someone who'd been certain it would hold. To my wife, Portia Lee Caston, I leave the Lakewood residence, with the outstanding mortgage to be satisfied from estate funds prior to transfer, and all personal furnishings contained therein. Her attorney put a hand on her arm. She shook it off. "That's not right." Her voice had gone strange and flat. "Check the document." Hutchins looked up over his glasses with the calm of someone who'd witnessed this particular kind of collapse before. "The document is what it is, Mrs. Caston." He would not do this. She was on her feet, both hands pressed flat against the table. I managed his household for 3 years. I gave up my career to support what he was building. I was his partner. I was always there. "Portia," I said quietly. "Don't speak to me." Her voice broke on the last word. "You weren't there. You missed everything. You're just some old man from Indiana who showed up after the money was already real, and now you think you can." "Your attorney can contest the will," I said. "That's your right." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag and walked out without another word. The contest was filed 11 days later. Galvin argued undue influence, mental vulnerability, and what he called a systematic campaign by an absentee father to exploit familial guilt. It was a serious filing, and my daughter-in-law had resources to back it. Barlow flew into Dallas the weekend before the hearing. He slept in the second bed of my motel room and drank the complimentary coffee, and told me the same thing he'd been telling me for 40 years. That the truth was harder to knock down than people who didn't have it always assumed. Hutchins and Price had been thorough. They produced medical records showing Keaton had been in excellent health, mentally and physically, right up until the stroke. They had testimony from 2 colleagues who'd worked closely with him in the months before his death, both describing a man who was sharp, decisive, and entirely in command of his own mind. They had phone records. In the last full year of his life, I had called Keaton 11 times. He had called me 9. That was the honest and complete accounting of our contact. Not a sustained campaign of anything. Just a father and son who called each other on birthdays and holidays and occasional Sunday afternoons when one of them thought of something the other might want to hear. Galvin tried hard. He had a way of making ordinary things sound ominous. Unexplained urgency in the estate planning timeline, he called it, though the will had been written 14 months before Keaton's death. He called me to the stand. Is it fair to say your relationship with your son had become distant in recent years? We weren't as close as I would have wanted, I said. I wish I'd visited more. But there was never a time he didn't pick up the phone when I called. And yet you had very little knowledge of his daily life, his business, his marriage. That's true. Doesn't that strike you as the relationship of a father who wasn't really present? I thought about that for a moment. It strikes me as the relationship of a father who was trying to respect that his son had built his own life, and maybe waited too long to figure out how to fit into it. But present or not present isn't the same thing as loved or not loved. Those are different measures. The judge was a woman named Bellamy, gray-haired and deliberate. She'd reviewed the full case over 2 weeks and returned to the courtroom on a Monday morning in late May. The court finds no credible evidence of undue influence, fraud, or diminished capacity at the time of execution. The testator was demonstrably competent. His choice of beneficiary, while perhaps unexpected to some parties, falls entirely within his rights. The will of Keaton Lawrence Caston is upheld as written. In the hallway, my daughter-in-law passed me without looking up. Galvin was already on his phone, and I had the sense he was composing the bill he was about to send her. I walked outside into the May sunshine and stood on the courthouse steps until my eyes adjusted to the light. Barlow came up behind me and put a hand on my shoulder. "What are you going to do first?" he asked. "Drive home," I said, "then figure it out." What I hadn't told Barlow, what I hadn't told anyone, was that there had been a sealed letter included with the will documents, written in Keaton's hand and addressed to me. Hutchins had given it to me the morning after the reading, in a plain white envelope with my name on the front in his handwriting. I had opened it alone in the parking garage, sitting in my truck with the engine off. It wasn't long. Keaton had never been a man who used more words than he needed. He wrote that he'd spent a long time thinking about money, what it meant, what it did to people around him, how it had quietly changed things in ways he hadn't predicted when he was still chasing it. He wrote that he'd come to understand the difference between being chosen and being useful, and that the difference mattered more than he'd expected. He wrote that his father was the only person in his adult life who had ever wanted nothing from him except for him to be okay. He wrote that he remembered, after his mother died, sitting at the kitchen table in Terre Haute doing homework, while his father ate a bowl of cereal standing at the counter, because there was something broken about sitting down to dinner, when there were only 2 of you and one of them was still learning how to be a family without the person who'd held it together. He wrote that he'd been ashamed of that image for years, ashamed that he hadn't been able to give his father more, hadn't been able to make those years easier. And then he'd come to understand that what he'd actually witnessed was a man refusing to fall apart in front of his son. He wrote, "Dad, you raised me on next to nothing, and I turned it into something. The least I can do is make sure you don't spend the last part of your life worrying. That's all this is. That's the whole of it." I read it twice in that parking garage, and then folded it and put it in my shirt pocket, next to the photo of him at 12, with the catfish and the gap-toothed grin. I drove back to Terre Haute over 2 days, stopping for the night in Texarkana. The landscape shifted as I moved north, Texas scrub giving way to Arkansas pine, then the rolling green of the Ozarks, then the flatter, greener Midwest I'd known all my life. Corn in the fields not yet knee-high, farm stands with hand-lettered signs, the sky opening up the way it does when you get above 37 degrees of latitude, wide and pale blue and unhurried. I'd been worried, somewhere in the back of my mind, that $17 million would change who I was. I'd seen what money did to people, not just my daughter-in-law, but others over the years, neighbors, distant relatives, people who came into more than they were ready for, and let it quietly dismantle the person they'd been before it arrived. But pulling into my driveway in Terre Haute, seeing the same old house with the gutters I'd been meaning to replace for 3 years, and the birch tree Darlene had planted the spring before Keaton was born, I didn't feel changed. I felt like myself. I felt like a man who'd done a long stretch of driving and could now go inside and take his boots off. I stood in my garage for a while, at my workbench looking at the photo. The Ivy Tech scholarship already had a name. Hutchins had told me Keaton set it up himself quietly, 2 months after he'd written the will. First-generation students in business and construction management. The same building blocks Keaton had used when he got to Dallas, with nothing but an education, and the belief that work was a form of honesty. I picked up the phone and called the college's financial aid office. "My name is Merle Caston," I said. "I understand there's a scholarship fund in my son's name. I'd like to talk to someone about expanding it." The woman on the other end paused just a beat, the way people do when something surprises them in a good direction. "Yes, sir," she said. "We'd be glad to talk to you." Outside, the birch tree was catching the late afternoon light the way it always did in May. Every leaf, bright and new, trembling in a breeze I couldn't feel from where I stood. Keaton had written that he wanted me not to worry for the rest of my life. What I understood, standing there in the garage with the phone in my hand, and his picture on the bench and the whole long ordinary afternoon stretching out ahead of me, was that he'd given me something more than money. He'd given me proof. Proof that all those years of cereal dinners and stilted phone calls and showing up, even when I didn't know quite how to show up, had meant something to someone who meant everything to me. Some men think the measure of a father is what he provides. Keaton had come to understand that the measure is what you remain, what you stay, quietly, year after year, without needing to be seen doing it. I hadn't known he'd noticed. Turns out he'd been watching the whole time.